War II was a total war, with Germany committing all its forces against the war. The path of the war was marked by the relentless struggle of the parties, yet none emerged victorious on the battlefield. Both sides had to find a fundamental solution, and avoiding direct confrontation required using a new method to change the balance of power. Hitler had discovered that the best weapon was nothing other than spies. He had strengthened his spies to strike at the heart of the military and political information of the Allied countries. The results of this weapon fundamentally changed the course of Hitler's war. Hitler knew well that the ultimate power was not in tanks, missiles, fighter planes, or human forces, but in information. Winning the power game required information. Hitler had brought the leaders of the Allies, namely Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, into a Russian roulette game. At any moment, a bullet could prove fatal to one of them. However, Hitler had repeatedly won this game because he himself placed the bullets in the guns. The leaders of the powers decided to arrange a confidential meeting, but no one except for those three was informed about the time and place of the session. The Soviet and British security apparatuses are trying to keep Hitler and the Nazi Party unaware of this meeting. The German spy apparatus is monitoring their messages, reports, and contacts moment by moment. Eventually, the German spy apparatus breaks the code of these conversations. Hitler intends to emerge victorious in the Great War in Tehran. The Übermensch, or the precursor, had a sinister plan: assassination. The shadow of Hitler's gun barrel loomed over Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. Hitler had attempted such action before, and most of them had been successful. He knew without a doubt that no one but him was destined to be the victor in this battle. The Germans are preparing themselves for a seemingly small but profound battle. 6 groups of German paratroopers land in cities near Tehran. Who among the leaders will betray the Übermensch? How did the leaders of the Allied countries survive the assassination plot? We want to unveil, for the first time, several crucial espionage operations in World War II. To do this, we must go back to the early years of the war, namely 1937. In 1937, Hitler put a plan into action for the first time to deliver significant blows to the Soviet Union without leaving a trace, and to entangle the Soviet Union in issues, both weakening Stalin and diverting his attention somewhat from Germany. Stalin, as a pressure-based dictator, exerts maximum pressure on his military and political forces, leading to dissatisfaction among some senior officers and military personnel. Hitler had learned that Stalin suspected a conspiracy against himself and intended to search the espionage files to Germany to see if there was any evidence of a plot by Soviet officers or not. This situation was preparing Germany for an intelligence attack. Heinrich, the head of the German security service, consults with his deputies and decides to plant the idea of the conspiracy in Stalin's mind. The head of the German security service believed that by doing so, they could deliver a blow to the leader of the Red Army, who had been thinking of putting aside thoughts of war with Germany for years. Now, all they needed were false pieces of information that would convince Stalin of a conspiracy against him. After several months of searching, German security service agents stumbled upon an archive of old espionage documents that they deemed suitable for their purpose. These documents date back to 10 years ago when during the Coma operation, Soviet and German forces had close cooperation, and Germans had close communications with the Russian officers in public events. German officers, based on their duties at that time, reported all Russian affairs, including complaints, jokes, grievances, intimate relationships, and clumsy situations. These reports had little value at the time, but were considered valuable intelligence during the war. Hitler, realizing the importance of executing his plan, ordered that this scam be kept hidden even from his own officers. Henrik, with the help of a trusted group of officers, secretly removed the files of the Coma operation from the archives and began to re-examine them. The files were reorganized, creating connections through the contents and statements of Russian officers that could be perceived as a conspiracy. Now, these documents, prepared in less than 2 months, had to reach individuals and commanders such as General Tukhachevsky, who was one of the high-ranking officials in the Soviet Union. In the early month of 1938, the Soviet Union began pressuring its agents to find a source or sources in Germany to access these files. In Czechoslovakia, a German officer who pretended to be willing to work for the Soviet Union contacted a Soviet officer at the embassy of this country and informed him that he was willing to hand over the files they were looking for in exchange for a payment of 3 million rubles. After exchanging encrypted telegrams between the relevant officers at the Soviet embassy in Czechoslovakia and Moscow, Stalin agreed to make the payment. However, Stalin was not one to owe anyone. On the appointed night, a person from the Soviet government, whose identity was kept secret, went to the designated location to meet with the German officer. The files were presented, but the requested money was rejected. The Soviet agent quickly transferred the files to Moscow. The German government realized that all the money was counterfeit. Stalin, thinking he had deceived the German officer, lit his cigarette. He was unaware of the sinister plan behind the scenes of the files.
На двух, на трех. Пострелок всегда до одного себя. Я был на этих заседаниях на двух, на трех. Власть все время меня не оставляла. Я был на этих заседаниях на двух, на трех. Пострелок всегда до одного себя. Я был на этих заседаниях на двух, на трех.
In reality, Interrogators did not consider that 10 years ago, on Stalin's order, Soviet officers collaborated in arming Germany. It took nearly a year for the scope of investigations and interrogations to reach the top command of the Red Army in May 1938. Marshal Tukhachevsky faced a heavy case, and it didn't take long before he was arrested and executed. About 20,000 officers were detained and imprisoned, with about one-third of them holding active positions. Germany sought to determine how many individuals, with what amount of equipment, and at what time it could inflict significant blows on the Soviet army from within. However, this plan was the first step towards fulfilling Hitler's desires. In 1938, Hitler proposed a deal to Stalin, but Stalin was not in a position to accept it. The offer was a non-aggression pact, allowing Hitler to pursue his other goals. In this pact, the fate of Poland was revealed, and Hitler agreed to Soviet non-interference in Germany's invasion of Western Poland. In return, Stalin annexed Eastern Poland to his country. When Germany invaded Poland in early September 1939, the most devastating war in human history unfolded. With a non-so-deep analysis, it must be said that the excessive war repression demanded in the Treaty of Versailles led to the breaking of the pride of the Germans. In this treaty, 13% of their territory, 10% of the population, 75% of mineral reserves, and iron and 25% of the highest quality coal mines were taken away from them to humiliate their country. The Germans used another method to showcase their power, which was an aerial display. For example, they entered a silver-colored bomber into the Zurich International Air Competition and pretend it was part of mass production. When observers measured its speed, they concluded that it was faster than all other planes. With this description, Western intelligence service believed that the German military had a long-range bomber that Allied fighters couldn't track. Originally, that pencil-shaped plane was called 17DO, and it was not an operational aircraft. Its sole purpose was to instill fear and terror in the hearts of the Allies. However, Hitler's plan was successful, and the Allies were frightened enough by the imaginary power he projected at that time. For example, the Times newspaper in London had reported that the Germans had built a 4-engine bomber capable of carrying 5 tons of bombs over the English Channel to reach London, even though the Germans did not possess such an aircraft. England allocated substantial budgets for building fighter planes and started constructing high-speed tracking aircraft in response. After the occupation of Poland, Hitler was not fully prepared for an all-out war. However, despite declaring war on Germany after the occupation of Poland, France and England were not inclined towards war. The main reason was the grandiosity that Hitler had constructed around himself and his air force. However, they had no choice but to enter the war, and the leaders of the Allied powers began planning to confront the Nazi Party. Amidst these developments, whispers of a coup were heard from within Germany. News of internal strife and a coup against Hitler spread worldwide. According to these reports, internal conflicts were escalating and army officers intended to overthrow the Nazi Party. The leaders of France and England, upon hearing this news, halted their warplanes against the Nazi Party. They were anticipating a military coup as it had lower costs both financially and in terms of lives. The news was gradually reaching its saturation point, and some media outlets predicted the fall of the Nazi Party within a few days. The Nazi generals had proposed the arrest of Hitler, and this entire scenario was accepted by the Allies as reliable documents and information. One of the generals flew to London to present his plan for evaluation by the espionage network. However, for assessing and evaluating their own operations, the Germans had a valuable source in England, Charles Howard Ellis. He had been employed by the Germans since 1920 when he served in Paris. After returning to London, he engaged in selling top-secret documents back to the Germans. In 1938, Ellis was responsible for translating stolen documents from Germany at the British Secret Service Center. He had very close relationships with the assessments of officers and senior officials of the service, and he could have their opinions about the generals and dissidents in Germany and convey them to the Germans. Major Soham informed the Stevens Group that any military movements by the Allies on the Western Front would thwart their conspiracy against Hitler and his arrest. On the other hand, politicians who were not interested in confronting Hitler decided to prevent engagement and wait for a coup against Hitler. Despite these operations, England and the Allies still hoped that the generals would take action against Hitler. Suddenly, all the news coming from Germany took on a new face. Behind these events, there was no one but the German Secret Service. Hitler had realized that he couldn't stand against countries like France and England with his real military power. Accordingly, he needed more time to strengthen the army. On the other hand, he had to counteract the plans and military advances of England and France. Therefore, they created an artificial opposition group in Germany to make France and England believe that Germany was facing a military coup and there was no need to attack Germany. Unaware that all these plans were created and carried out by the German Secret Service and under Hitler's orders to provide the best possible opportunity to strengthen the Nazi forces. When the Allies discovered that the Nazi Party had gained power, they had to advance in the war and had lost time. The next step was the occupation of France. Hitler considered his main military arm to be the Nazi Party's intelligence service, and the German intelligence service now worked stronger and more experienced than before. France and England knew that the Germans were ready to occupy France. Assuming that, similar to World War I, the attack would come through Belgium, they established a defensive barrier along the Belgian border. However, Hitler, using information from his intelligence services, was aware of this defense and, for this reason, launched an assault on France through Belgium. The German army entered France through the Ardennes forest and, through operational maneuvers, surrounded the Allies, especially the English, on the Dunkirk coast. However, when the Allies, especially the English, were in conflict with the German army, a 48-hour halt in the war occurred by Hitler's order, which until then remained an ambiguity. This created an opportunity for the English to escape, and they had Hitler to thank for it. With this turn of events, the English managed to escape and prepare themselves for the challenging days ahead. The war intensified every day, and Hitler realized that he had to move all his pieces on the chessboard. Hitler attacked England, demanding surrender through a letter to Churchill, the Prime Minister of England. However, Churchill refused, and the British Army, with an indomitable resistance, managed to prevent the occupation of their territory. The German army was forced to retreat. That Allied countries discovered Hitler's secrets, which was the same intelligence service, and gained insight into its power. Now it was the turn of the Allied countries to strike a blow to Germany using the power of their intelligence services. In Africa, the German General Rommel was deployed to the continent in February 1941 and achieved significant victories against the English. They managed to advance 300 miles within a week and cross the border of Egypt. However, the major obstacle in Rommel's path was the German general. The outcome of battles had undergone change, and the victor of the fields was the one who gained the most influence and information. The Allies, especially the English, who had invested in breaking the Nazi Party's communication codes for years, succeeded after extensive efforts in breaking the codes of Germany and Italy. With access to these secrets, they could identify the time and location of the logistical caravans' movements. Based on this information, they would launch attacks on any caravans at the right moment. These consecutive victories weakened Hitler, and the pulse of the war was in the hands of the Allies. Since the beginning of the war, the encrypted wireless communications between the United States and England had been a cause for great concern for the Germans, and they were attempting to decipher these codes. Finally, after numerous efforts, the Minister of Post and Telegraph of Germany succeeded, and on March 6, 1942, the code was finally discovered. From that date onward, the Germans became aware of the negotiations. It was time for the leaders of the Allied countries, namely Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, to put the finishing touches on their plans. Knowing about the capabilities of the German intelligence service, they decided to arrange a more in-person meeting because they were aware that if their communication remained encrypted as before, there was possibility that their plans, considering the successive defeats of Germany towards the end of the war, the assassination of the Allied leaders could have been a refreshing move for the Germans in a war that was leading them to collapse. In 1943, Tehran became the capital of espionage, as only the Russians sent about 3,000 security agents to the capital of Iran, and the Germans deployed dozens of professional terrorist soldiers, landing them with parachute, to carry out a mission that could turn the tide of victory in favor of Germany. The anticipated time was approaching. Hitler asked Heinrich Himmler, the commander of the German SS forces, to investigate the method of assassinating the Allied leaders and to send a detailed plan to Tehran. Assassinating the Allies, and various ideas were proposed. Eventually, the main plan received Hitler's approval. The leaders of the Allied countries were also making preparations for the Tehran Conference. After the victory in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Russians had strengthened their espionage apparatus in Iran. Stalin assured Churchill and Roosevelt that everything would be under their control. Therefore, the Russians sent Fabian Martinsen to Iran to strengthen and organize their espionage apparatus in the country, providing them with greater readiness. In fact, Martinsen had come to introduce new methods to Vartensky, the head of the Russian intelligence in Tehran. Beria was the head of the Russian espionage service, and although he was satisfied with the activities of Russian spies, especially in safeguarding Iran's transnational railway from the attacks of German spies and mercenaries, he was not content with defensive measures like Vartensky's. Therefore, Fabian Martinsen was sent to Iran to assist Andrei Vartensky, who lacked comprehensive information due to the efforts of German agents and even English and American rivals. As a result, Roosevelt was very concerned about his presence in Tehran and tried to change the plan through Churchill. Stalin, who had noticed Roosevelt's concern, wrote a decisive letter to Roosevelt on November 5th. It is self-evident that the decision to attend or not attend the Tehran Conference is ultimately up to you. Although Roosevelt resisted again, he ultimately expressed his agreement to attend the Tehran Conference on November 8th. Although on the eve of the conference Stalin suddenly fell ill, and differences arose between England and America, eventually everyone headed to Tehran. Roosevelt, very concerned about his life, had instructed his official to ensure that the identities of the passengers. The Germans discovered the exact time and initiated their actions. The Nazi party's think tank presented 60 elite forces and paratroopers for the operation to assassinate the leaders in Tehran to Hitler and Heydrich, most of whom were Russian paratroopers. Hitler expressed great concern about this list, and he was not in favor of involving a significant number of Russian paratroopers in the operation. His advisors emphasized that there was not enough time, and any delay in carrying out the operation would undoubtedly expose their plan. Hitler was afraid that the Russian paratroopers might be double agents and disrupt the operation. Ultimately, under pressure, Hitler issued the order to carry out the operation contrary to his preference. 6 groups of German paratroopers landed near Lake Namak in Common Kasvin, respectively, and prepared themselves to enter Tehran. Of this group of 60, 6 were Germans, and the rest were Russians. These 60 individuals comprised 8 units under the command of the Russian Schwarzkopf. However, some of them were under the supervision of Russian intelligence organizations acting as dissidents against the Soviet Union under German command. Hitler closely monitored the events in Tehran and the ongoing operations moment by moment. The head of Soviet security services easily recognized that the targeted location must be Tehran. Therefore, the Allies were fully prepared to confront the German terrorist attacks. It was time for the show to begin. The paratroopers had reached Tehran, and the Allied leaders were entering the meeting venue one by one. Hitler saw victory as he imagined it coming closer. When the Russian paratroopers entered Tehran, they introduced themselves to the Russian forces with disbelief and revealed that the idea of paratroopers and individuals had been selected through the leaders of the Allied nations. It became clear that Hitler never understood who the traitors in this operation were. He couldn't believe that the technique he himself had invented would lead to his failure in the assassination operation and the war.